In May 1938, Adolf Hitler crossed the Austrian border to thunderous applause. Crowds packed the streets, flags filled the air, and the promise of national rebirth drowned out quieter fears. Austria ceased to exist almost overnight, absorbed into the Third Reich as the Anschluss transformed political reality with breathtaking speed. Yet beneath the celebration lay terror. Anyone marked as an enemy of the new order understood what followed next: arrest, disappearance, or death. Within months, more than 70,000 Austrians were imprisoned. Political opponents, Jews, intellectuals, and those who simply refused to conform were swept away by a system that moved faster than most could comprehend. For many, the danger arrived not with dramatic violence, but with paperwork, knock-on-the-door orders, and signatures that sealed fates before a word was spoken. And among the thousands watching this transformation unfold was a 30-year-old Austrian police officer named Franz Stangl, a man who believed he was standing safely on the side of order. Stangl had been raised Catholic in a society that valued discipline, obedience, and respect for authority. He was not a street brawler or a rabble-rousing extremist. He wore a uniform, followed procedures, and believed deeply in structure. When the Nazi regime made loyalty a condition for advancement, the choice before him did not feel like a moral collapse. It felt like a career decision. He joined, convinced that stability, not cruelty, was the goal. Nazi propaganda worked with surgical precision. It fused nationalism with duty, racial ideology with social order, and obedience with virtue. In Austria, religious language was subtly repurposed to align Catholic morality with Nazi loyalty. For men like Stangl, the transition required no sudden hatred, only acceptance. The system rewarded those who did not question. Those who adapted rose quickly, those who hesitated vanished. By 1939, Adolf Hitler launched what was officially described as a public health initiative, the euthanasia program. Its purpose was framed as mercy. In reality, it was a radical experiment in state-sponsored killing. Disabled children, the mentally ill, and individuals labeled unfit were selected for elimination in the name of racial purity. One of the program's central killing centers was Schloss Hartheim, a castle converted into a place of death. Stangl accepted an administrative role there. At Hartheim, murder was sanitized through language and routine. Death certificates were falsified. Families received carefully worded letters. Inside the castle, victims were killed by injection or gas, their bodies cremated without ceremony. Officially, this was compassionate care. Unofficially, Hartheim served a far darker purpose. It became a laboratory. Engineers refined gassing techniques using engine exhaust fumes. Doctors and administrators learned how to move bodies efficiently, manage staff, and process death without emotional disruption. This was not yet the Holocaust, but the foundations were being laid, brick by brick, form by form. For the men who worked there, psychological distance was essential. Victims were reduced to numbers, procedures replaced faces. Responsibility was fragmented so completely that no single person felt accountable. Stangl did not pull a lever or seal a door, but he ensured that the system functioned smoothly. That distinction would later become his shield. As the euthanasia program expanded, so did the regime's confidence. Killing could be organized, concealed, and justified. Public protest, when it emerged, was minimal and easily suppressed. The lesson was clear: mass murder was possible without rebellion if it was framed correctly and hidden from view. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The invasion was swift and brutal. Within weeks, the Polish state collapsed under the force of blitzkrieg. But victory brought an unforeseen problem. Hundreds of thousands of Jews now lived under direct German control. Ghettos were established almost immediately, sealing entire communities behind walls of hunger, disease, and despair. At the same time, mobile SS killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army eastward, executing civilians in forests, fields, and mass graves. These shootings were horrifyingly effective, but they carried a cost. Ammunition was consumed rapidly. The process was public, messy, and psychologically damaging even for seasoned killers. Reports reached Berlin describing SS men who drank heavily, suffered breakdowns, or could no longer continue. The regime needed a method that was faster, quieter, and less emotionally corrosive. The solution was already waiting. In the files of the euthanasia program were men who knew how to kill without chaos. Men trained to think in terms of efficiency rather than humanity. Men who had learned that distance from the victim was the key to endurance. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, understood this perfectly. When plans for a final solution began to solidify, he did not search for new recruits. He repurposed the old ones. Franz Stangl was selected. His transfer did not come with dramatic speeches or explicit explanations. It came as an assignment, another posting, another step upward. By this point, the transformation was complete. What had begun as applause in Vienna had become an invisible machinery of death stretching across occupied Europe. Stangl no longer needed to be convinced, he only needed to perform. And somewhere in the forests of occupied Poland, construction was already underway on places designed not to imprison, but to erase. Before we go further, take a moment to reflect on how this story unfolds not through monsters, but through ordinary men and ordinary decisions. If this kind of deeply researched historical storytelling matters to you, please click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps bring these important stories to more people, ensuring they are not forgotten. The path from Hartheim to Poland was not a leap, it was a continuation. A system tested on the vulnerable was about to be unleashed on an entire people, refined by experience and protected by bureaucracy. What awaited Stangl in his next assignment would push mass murder beyond experimentation into full industrialization. In September 1939, German forces crossed into Poland with overwhelming speed. Tanks tore through borders, aircraft darkened the skies, and within weeks the Polish state collapsed. What followed was not merely occupation, but a radical reordering of life itself. For the Nazi leadership, Poland was not just conquered territory, it was a laboratory. With the invasion came an immediate and terrifying reality. Hundreds of thousands of Jews now lived under direct German rule. The regime had spoken endlessly of removal and purity, but it had never faced the logistical challenge of controlling so many people at once. The solution unfolded in stages, each one harsher than the last, each one testing how far the system could go without resistance. Jewish communities were herded into ghettos carved out of Polish cities. High walls sealed them off from the outside world. Inside, starvation, disease, and overcrowding became tools of control. Families were forced into single rooms, children scavenged for scraps. Death arrived quietly and daily, long before any camp was reached. The ghettos were meant to isolate, weaken, and dehumanize, turning entire populations into a problem waiting for a final answer. Beyond the ghettos, a different form of killing was already underway. Special SS units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the German army eastward. Their task was simple and horrifying: identify Jews, political leaders, and undesirables, march them to secluded locations, and execute them en masse. Forests, ravines, and open fields became killing grounds. Entire villages disappeared into mass graves. At first, the shootings seemed brutally efficient. Thousands could be murdered in a single operation. But cracks soon appeared, ammunition supplies were strained. The killings were visible to local populations. Most troubling for the SS leadership, the psychological toll on the shooters themselves began to surface. Reports described men unable to continue, suffering breakdowns, turning to alcohol, or requesting transfers. Mass murder, it turned out, was not as simple as pulling a trigger again and again. Heinrich Himmler understood the danger. A genocidal system that relied on emotional endurance was unstable. If the perpetrators faltered, the entire project risked collapse. What was needed was distance. A way to kill without seeing faces, without hearing screams, without the intimate violence of bullets at close range. The answer had already been tested elsewhere. In the files of the euthanasia program, were records of successful mass gassing operations. Victims died enclosed, unseen, and quickly. Administrators reported fewer psychological casualties among staff. The process was cleaner, quieter, and easier to deny. What had been used against the disabled and mentally ill could now be scaled up. This was the moment when ideology hardened into policy. By late 1941, Himmler and the Nazi leadership committed fully to what would be known as the final solution. The goal was no longer displacement or containment, it was total annihilation. Jews across occupied Europe were to be murdered systematically, far from major cities, in locations designed for secrecy and speed. Extermination camps were planned in remote areas of occupied Poland, hidden among forests and railway lines. They would not resemble concentration camps with barracks and labor schedules. These places would exist for one purpose only: killing. To operate them, Himmler needed men who already understood the mechanics of death without hesitation. Men like Franz Stangl. Stangl's transfer east was framed as another administrative assignment. He was not briefed on ideology. He did not attend grand conferences announcing genocide. Orders arrived through channels he trusted, phrased in the language of efficiency and duty. By now, he had learned that questions were dangerous and obedience was rewarded. When he arrived in occupied Poland, the landscape itself seemed to swallow sound. Villages were sparse, forests stretched endlessly. Rail lines cut through the terrain like veins. This was where the regime intended to make people disappear. The camps were built near existing railway hubs, ensuring a constant flow of human cargo. Trains would arrive filled with men, women, and children from ghettos across Europe. The victims would not stay long. There would be no need for food stores, medical facilities, or long-term housing. Everything was designed around immediacy. Killing had become a logistical challenge, and the solution was architecture. At the same time, the language surrounding the operation grew more deceptive. Deportations were described as resettlement. Camps were referred to as transit facilities. Even within the SS, euphemisms softened reality. Words like special treatment replaced murder, paperwork concealed intent. The system depended on lies not just to its victims, but to itself. For the Jewish populations trapped in ghettos, rumors spread constantly. Trains would arrive, victims would be processed. Bodies would be disposed of, everything would run on schedule. The transition marked a final step in his transformation. The distance that once protected him began to shrink, not emotionally, but operationally. He would no longer be one part of his system, he would be the system. In early 1942, Stangl was sent deeper into eastern Poland, toward a place few outside the SS had ever heard of. There, surrounded by forest and silence, a camp was nearing completion. It would not become famous at first. It would not produce photographs or survivors' testimonies immediately. But it would become one of the most efficient killing centers the Nazi regime ever built. And when the first trains arrived, the machinery of death would move so smoothly that many victims would not understand what was happening until it was already over. In early 1942, Franz Stangl arrived at a clearing deep within the forests of eastern Poland. The place was called Sobibor. There were no towns nearby, no curious onlookers, only trees, barbed wire, and newly laid railway tracks that disappeared into the distance. To the outside world, it did not exist. To the Nazi leadership, it was the future of mass murder. Stangl later claimed that he believed he was being assigned to an ordinary supply or transit camp. Whether this was self-deception or calculated denial remains uncertain. What is clear is that when he arrived, gas chambers were already under construction. The technology perfected at Schloss Hartheim was about to be applied on a scale never attempted before. Sobibor was designed for speed. There were no large barracks, no long-term prisoners, no labor infrastructure beyond what was needed to maintain the killing process. Trains would arrive, be unloaded, and depart again within hours. The victims were not meant to stay. They were meant to vanish. Deception was built into every step of the operation. From ghettos across occupied Poland and beyond, Jews were ordered to report for resettlement. They were told to bring valuables, documents, and clothing. Many were forced to pay for their own transport. The lie was carefully crafted. Labor camps did exist elsewhere, and the promise of work offered a fragile hope that clung even in the face of terror. The journey itself was a torment. Packed into cattle cars, men, women, and children traveled for days without food, water, or sanitation. Some died before the trains reached their destination. Those who survived arrived exhausted, disoriented, and desperate for relief. That exhaustion was not accidental, it was part of the process. At Sobibor, Stangl imposed order. He wore a crisp uniform, he insisted on cleanliness. The campgrounds were made to appear organized, even welcoming. New arrivals were greeted by guards who spoke calmly and gave instructions. They were told they had reached a transit camp and would soon be showered and assigned to work. The language was deliberate. Panic slowed operations, calm kept people moving. Families were separated under the pretense of efficiency. Men were told to line up on one side, women and children on the other. Hair was shaved to prevent lice, clothing was collected for disinfection. Personal belongings were carefully sorted, catalogued, and sent back into the German economy. Nothing was wasted, not even hope. Victims were then driven down a narrow path enclosed by barbed wire and branches, hidden from view. The guards called it the tube. It curved through the forest, preventing anyone at the entrance from seeing what lay ahead. To those walking it, it felt endless. To the SS, it was a conveyor belt. At the end of the path stood low buildings disguised as bathhouses. Inside were gas chambers sealed with heavy doors. Engine exhaust fumes were piped directly into the rooms. There were no showers, no water. Once the doors closed, there was nowhere to run. Death followed within minutes. From arrival to murder, the entire process could take less than an hour. Under Stangl's command, Sobibor functioned with chilling efficiency. Trains arrived daily, the killing never stopped. In just 3 months, approximately 100,000 Jews were murdered there. The forest absorbed the sound, smoke drifted above the trees. Ashes were buried, then later exhumed and burned again to erase evidence. For those who carried out the killings, survival depended on denial. Stangl later explained that he never saw the victims as individuals. To do so, he claimed, would have made his role impossible. He focused instead on organization, schedules, and numbers. Disorder was his enemy, efficiency was his refuge. By reducing murder to routine, he insulated himself from its reality. Yet even within Sobibor, cracks appeared. Prisoners forced to work in the camp began to understand its true purpose. Whispers spread. A few dared to resist in small ways, sabotaging equipment or slowing processes. The tension beneath the surface grew with every transport. Fear hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The SS sensed it too. The longer Sobibor operated, the more dangerous it became for its own staff. Knowledge was leaking, witnesses existed. The very efficiency that made the camp successful also made it unstable. In Berlin, the solution was not to slow the killing, but to reorganize it. Franz Stangl was informed that his performance had been exemplary. Sobibor, they said, ran smoothly to smoothly. His skills were needed elsewhere, at a camp where chaos threatened productivity and where death on an even greater scale was demanded. Before he left, the machinery he had perfected would continue without him. The system no longer depended on a single man. That was its greatest strength and its greatest horror. Before we move forward, remember that stories like this survive only because they are told and retold, even when they are uncomfortable. If this kind of historical truth matters to you, please click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps ensure that these voices are not lost to time and that more people confront the realities of the past. Stangl's next assignment would place him at the center of the most lethal extermination camp of them all. There, the illusion of control would give way to overwhelming scale. and the consequences of bureaucratic obedience would reach their final form. When Franz Stangl was transferred to Treblinka in mid-1942, he entered a place already drowning in death. Unlike Sobibor, Treblinka had spiraled into chaos. Trains arrived faster than bodies could be disposed of. Corpses lay exposed under the sun, panic spread among both victims and guards. The camp was failing at its sole purpose, efficient annihilation. Stangl was sent not to question the system, but to fix it. From the moment he arrived, he imposed strict order. Paths were reorganized, killing schedules were tightened. Gas chambers were expanded. The camp was redesigned to function like an assembly line. Under his command, Treblinka became what Nazi leadership demanded, a perfectly calibrated machine of mass murder. Deception remained central. Victims arriving by train were greeted by signs pointing to a railway station, complete with fake clocks and painted buildings meant to resemble a civilian town. Loudspeakers announced instructions calmly. People were told they would shower and continue onward to work camps. Exhausted and terrified, many clung to the lie because the truth was unbearable. Once inside, the process moved with merciless speed. Families were stripped of identity within minutes. Clothing was removed, hair was cut, valuables were seized. Then the victims were driven into gas chambers powered by engine exhaust, the same method refined years earlier in Austria. The doors closed, silence followed. At Treblinka, as many as 12,000 Jews could be murdered in a single day. Bodies were first buried in mass graves, then later exhumed and burned when Nazi leadership ordered the destruction of evidence. Flames lit the sky day and night. The stench carried for miles. Ash fell like snow across the camp. The earth itself seemed unable to absorb what was happening. By the time Treblinka ceased operations in 1943, approximately 900,000 Jews had been murdered there. Combined with Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno, the death toll exceeded 1.5 million. These were not casualties of battle. They were civilians exterminated by design. As the Red Army advanced and the war turned against Germany, the extermination camps were dismantled. Buildings were destroyed, trees were planted to disguise mass graves. The Nazis hoped history itself could be buried. Franz Stangl fled. Like many former camp officials, he slipped through post-war chaos and escaped to South America. He lived under his own name for years, working in factories, raising a family, and blending into ordinary life. To neighbors, he was quiet and polite. The forests of Poland felt very far away, but memory did not disappear. One man refused to let it fade, Simon Wiesenthal. A survivor of Nazi camps himself, Wiesenthal dedicated his life to tracking down those responsible for genocide. For decades, he followed trails of paperwork, rumors, and half-forgotten testimonies. He believed justice mattered not only for punishment, but for truth. Eventually, the trail led to Stangl. He was arrested and extradited to stand trial in court. He did not deny his role. Instead, he defended it with the language he had used all his life. He claimed he was only an administrator, that he followed orders, that responsibility lay elsewhere. The court rejected that argument. Stangl was convicted for his role as commandant of Treblinka. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died shortly afterward, not anonymous, not forgotten, but recorded in history as one of the men who made industrial genocide possible. The horror of this story does not lie only in cruelty, it lies in normalcy. In forms signed, procedures followed, promotions accepted, and how easily a modern state turned administration into annihilation. The machinery of death was not built by monsters alone. It was built by men who believed they were simply doing their jobs.